Hello and welcome to the Cornish countryside once again. Today it's super misty. I'll do a little tour. Can you see how misty this is? Over there is St Michael's Mount, but you literally cannot see behind that field. It's proper misty. So today we're going to be talking about keeping things nice and simple. And I guess this has been inspired by being in Cornwall here, where you're away from your computers, you're away from all the complex problems, software development problems, that I've been tackling in the last year or so. And it's just allowed me to get my head sort of quiet and chilled out. And I was thinking about problems and how to solve problems, the best way of solving problems in a kind of a generic sense. And one thing that I've kind of realized over the years is there is something about keeping things nice and simple that really works, really helps, especially with software development, especially when we are tackling humongously complex problems when you think of the application in its entirety. Now there is a saying called KISS, which is keep it simple, stupid, which basically means to try and simplify things as much as possible. The more complicated you try and create the task, or you try and make the solution as complicated as possible, the more difficult it's going to get. Often when you simplify things, you break things down into smaller components, and that is exactly what we do with software development when we look at things like microservices, serverless technology. When we break things up into little containers, say in Docker, we're basically scaling down the application or parts of the application into smaller little chunks. So the trends in microservices, the trends in serverless technology, the trends in making things nice and small, so even micro frameworks, for example, they allow you to decouple parts of the application, to decouple certain processes or services of the application. And those parts of the application have, like I mentioned, their own responsibilities, their own requirements, their own needs, and so forth. But they only care about those things. So, for example, you could have a service that only cares about creating and sending out PDFs. You could even break that up even further. You could have something that just creates PDFs and another microservice that sends those PDFs out into an email queue. So that's very similar to perhaps event sourcing, where you have a event source queue. So those events would be put on a queue and then processed by some sort of mailer type thing. So when you're attacking an application in its whole entirety, maybe that was part of an invoice application, you can start scaling back those smaller processes, and they can live in their own little places. When you break up an application into these smaller little homes, these services, these environments, and so forth, you are then decoupling the actual features from the core of the application. This means that these features can be used elsewhere. For instance, if you wanted to decouple how a user gets managed, how a user gets saved, how the registration process works, how a user gets logged in, and how that user is then applied to other parts of the application. So, for example, they might have a feature where they like something, or they put in some feedback and therefore they need to be logged in, and so forth. Well, that feedback application, that part of the feedback application, maybe they're rating something, for example, that is itself its own little service. The service of registration, the service of logging in, that is a user management service. So you have two distinct services there, which means that you have two distinct responsibilities. Now, it doesn't matter if the user registration goes down, because the users that have already logged in can still do the feedback and do the rating and so forth in the feedback service. Now, if the feedback service went down, then people would still be able to register, because those two services are now independent of each other. From a mental perspective, when you are tackling a huge legacy system, for example, where you've got huge amounts of data that is very entwined and it's a complete mess, when you start decoupling things, when you start taking things out of the system in its own little domain, and you start focusing on what the requirements are for that small thing, and you put it under the microscope, it's actually far more easy to manage. It's more manageable because you're not managing the whole application in its entirety. What you can do is have some APIs around that small little service that the other applications can feed off of, or the other features in that application can feed off of. Therefore, you're slowly improving the system, the legacy system, over time, and you're creating APIs around that small service. And then once you've finished with that service, you then work on another service and so forth. I don't know if you can hear, but it's getting proper windy right now. Another really big pro with using microservices is that they help to break down in your mind the application. Okay, if you think of your application in its whole, right, if it's a massive application, think about having to picture all of that in your mind. It's very difficult, especially if it's a huge application, especially if it's doing a lot of stuff, right? So that is actually quite tricky, and it's actually quite stressful as well. So when you break these things into these small little succinct pieces of code, small little features, small little services, it feels much easier to manage in your mind. And also you can say to parts of your team, if you're working in a team, that one person deals with one part of that application, one service, and another person works with that part of the service, and so forth. And therefore no one is a master of the whole thing. It's a team effort, and that is fantastic. Which means that people can move around in the team. It means that you can go from one service to another service. Say, for example, someone on the team was specifically working on perhaps the rating system. Well, they can move from the rating system to the user management system if they wanted to, if they were getting bored. It also means that you can move team people around. Perhaps they go on holiday. Now, with serverless technology, of course, those parts of the application don't actually need to be running unless they need to be. So yes, you have the front end. Yes, you have the way the user is actually going to register, the way the user is actually going to rate those things. But the actual process behind it, the actual creating the user account and so forth, they don't actually have to be active unless they need to be active, unless they need to be spun up. And this, of course, makes the footprint of the whole application smaller, because it's only the footprint that is needed at that time. Crikey, look how misty this is. This is insane. I can't believe behind me is St. Michael's Mount and the sea and everything. That is incredible. I wonder if this mist is going to lift today. Of course, using microservices, using serverless technologies, using micro frameworks and all of those other trendy things, they all have their own pros and cons. They're not suddenly the superpowers of the web development thing. That these trends, these ideas, they also have their bad sides as well. So, you know, with microservices, you're now splitting your application into a bigger footprint, because you have lots of these little microservices floating around, which means that your attack surface is bigger. With micro frameworks, you have to do a lot more of the work up front, which in some cases is a good thing, and so forth, because you have a lot of choice and all of that stuff. With serverless technology, of course, you are sharing a lot of code in a lot of other places. Also, serverless technologies, they're not really, you know, they're, let's just face it, they're just someone else's server, but there is a cost implication that is associated to that too, and all of the other bits and pieces. There is the logging and the maintenance of these microservices, discovering which service is at fault and so forth. There's quite a DevOpsy type feel to that as well. Lots of skills that are required, lots of complicated skills that are required too. So this whole thing about splitting up your system to make things simpler might actually be quite complicated in the short term when you're actually starting to do it, because you have to learn about all of these concepts and everything. But really, this video is all about just trying to break up the application, making things smaller, making the problem smaller, and when it's more smaller, it's more manageable. When you just tackle a part of the application instead of tackling the whole thing at once, you can really microscopically go down to the code level and work out what actually needs to happen. And what you can do is slowly replace the monolithic application, if you will, into smaller little chunks, which is great. The thing is, as you start becoming a web developer, as you start building applications, if you tackle a legacy application that is pretty big, usually you find just by default a complicated solution because it's a complicated problem, and that isn't always required and needed. In fact, small simple solutions can be great solutions for large problems. I remember when I was starting out and we were dealing with, in my opinion, very complicated problems back then. Well, I would first assume that in order to fix that problem, I would then need to look at a complicated solution, because it was a complicated problem, right? I couldn't get my head around the fact that these simple solutions could actually fix the overall problem. If you've got a bug in a system and you're not too sure where in the system it is, whether it's a part of a certain feature or features, if it's a particular flow that the user has gone in, it's quite easy to just look at the whole thing in its entirety, right? But when you start doing that, when you start going down the user journey, discovering what the user did, when you start discounting things from the system, so it's not anything to do with that because I've checked that and so forth. It's a bit like the game Guess Who, right? Where you're slowly whittling down the possible solutions. When you start discounting things, when your options start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the problem itself gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore the solution becomes more identifiable. Thanks for watching. Happy coding, everyone. I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.